the hell is he? Where the hell is he? Hi, where the hell have you been? Burma? Burma? Yeah, Burma. Burma. Yeah, Burma. What were you doing there? You know, doing my bit, fighting the Japanese. I was all over, really. I mean, the north, the south, the middle part, which is hot and dusty and dry. You know, I'm glad I had this light rifle, that's for sure. It's funny, you know, the people there, they really liked me. And I must have been my, I don't know, my personality maybe. And you know what they called me? Yeah, the wandering hero. I just went from place to place and sorted out all the problems, yeah. Wandering hero. What, you? A wandering hero? More like a wandering zero.
Whoa! Stop it right there. Stop. Stop. Look, I was in Burma, see? And let me tell you, we never had anything that even remotely approached top-of-the-line kit, let alone some sort of funny-looking short rifle. I mean, that's a complete fabrication. He's probably just trying to buy into all that jungle carbine nonsense. Well, don't let him do it, because the next thing you know, he's going to want to spend summers in Rangoon and take luge lessons or something. All right, look, as long as you're aware that that little rifle didn't set foot in Burma during the war, we'll be okay. Just put it down to artistic license or something. All right? Good. Enjoy the video.
Fighting in the Far East, Burma in particular, exposed great weaknesses in the clothing, kit, and weaponry issued to the army. From 1943, an exhaustive study was undertaken that encompassed all areas of a soldier's issue. One of the recommendations to come out of this was for a new kind of rifle. This would use the number 4 as its base. Put into production during the latter stages of the Second World War, although not particularly seeing service during it. The new rifle was given the name the Rifle, number 5, and it would exhibit many of the characteristics called for. It was shorter, it was lighter, and it was handier. All the things that were needed in a close jungle environment. Through two friends of the channel, James and Vince, I've been able to get my hands on a number 5, 2 as a matter of fact, and I thought that it might be interesting to have a quick comparison between this rifle, the number 5, and the number 4, its earlier, bigger cousin. So we'll look at the characteristics of this rifle and compare them to those of the number 4. Also, we'll engage in a bit of comparative shooting, discussing the handiness of the rifle, its accuracy, and its overall performance at long and close range.
The rifle number 5 Mark I is perhaps a bit of a darling in the world of the Lee Enfield, if for no other reason than it being light, handy, and having a rather sexy nickname. Often termed the jungle carbine, in fact its development lies on a foundation much more rooted in general service, rather than jungle service. Moves were afoot as early as 1942 to search for a lighter and shorter service rifle. Examples were based on the number 4 and ran the gamut of simply being cut down, similar to a sporterized version, to more advanced and refined models. Despite this genesis, which was not rooted in jungle service, there is of course a connection. The Lethbridge Mission. In 1943, an exhaustive study was initiated to assess the Army's clothing, kit, and weapons in great relation to Far East service. This study was headed by General Lethbridge. It was, quite possibly, the most comprehensive such study undertaken during the war. It looked at everything a soldier carried, right down to the most minutest of items. And this, of course, included the soldier's rifle. The deductions made during the study were acted upon, and essentially this led to a whole new suite of equipment, clothing, and weapon to replace the somewhat ad hoc supply of dyed jungle green battle dress, new web equipment to replace the 1937 set, and ultimately a new rifle, by then confirmed as being the number 5, was to be issued. Due to wartime economies, essentially none of these items saw wartime service. So despite the rifle's development beginning not necessarily with the Lethbridge mission, it certainly was tied to its findings and recommendations in the end. To add to the somewhat confusing history of this rifle, its use was not necessarily intended to be confined to Far East service. In fact, it was at one point in serious consideration as a total replacement for the number 4 in general service, its various outward characteristics being seen as beneficial in all theaters. However, due to its inevitable link to the Lethbridge mission's findings, and indeed its use post-war in Far East environments, its nickname of the Jungle Carbine has stuck and is nearly ubiquitously referred to as such by the firearms community. The number 5 certainly met the requirement to be lighter and handier. It weighed 7 pounds 1 ounce compared to the number 4's 8 pounds 10 ounces, and its overall length was 5 inches shorter at 39.5 inches. Despite its obvious cosmetic differences, it still very much was of the Lee Enfield pedigree. Its lines and general shape, as well as its mechanics, would have been familiar to any soldier. The butt had a rubber pad held in place by a steel cap. This was done to make shooting of the rifle somewhat more comfortable. More on that later. The rear sling swivel was moved to a position on the right side of the butt and was of the fixed variety. If one was to look at the action body, receiver in today's money, one would have to be hard-pressed to differentiate it from the number 4 if one wasn't reasonably well versed in the differences. The bolt was held in its place using the same catch arrangement as was found on the number 4 Mark I, with the catch being depressed to free the bolt head. The magazine catch, the safety catch, and the sights were all in their usual places. The back sight was of 2 patterns. The Mark I was similar to that of the Mark I sight found on the number 4. It was milled and of high quality. Whilst the Mark II type was similar to the Marks III and 4 found on the number 4, being constructed of stamped metal. In both cases, they were graduated to a maximum range of 800 yards, and both included a battle sight. The slide was fitted with a smaller aperture for more precise shooting. Distinctively, the fore end was cut down considerably, and a nose cap was fitted. There were 2 types, although some production didn't include one at all. Next to the stock, the most distinctive feature of the number 5 was its flash hider. This incorporated the hider proper, the bayonet lug, and the front sight assembly. This was fitted due to the shorter barrel having a greater signature at night. Using the lug and the end of the flash hider, the number 3 bayonet was fixed. This returned to the hilted catch and ring style of bladed bayonet as had been used with the SMLE and previous types of rifles. It was shorter, of course, with an 8-inch blade and had a Bowie-type profile. Here we can see a comparison of the number 5 with the number 4 Mark I star. The difference in length is obviously noticeable. When we look closely, more differences do appear. One of the principal manufacturing techniques was to include various so-called lightning cuts on some of the parts. The bottom of the bolt handle was drilled out. The butt had a somewhat slimmer profile and was not as deep at the butt plate. There was metal milled away at the reinforce, or Knox form, as well as underneath the backsight. These cuts were present on both sides of the rifle. Of course, more weight was saved in the cutting down of the stock, despite the addition of the flash hider. The bayonets had similar lengths, although with the obvious differences in design and complexity. The number 5 was first produced as simply a lightened number 4, and a small batch was available for trials by mid-1944. It would seem that the first use of the by then officially named number 5 Mark I, done in the list of changes of September 1944, was in field trials and evaluations conducted in the Netherlands during the campaign for the Scheldt. Here, men, most likely of the 52nd Lowland Division, are seen in November 1944 conducting amphibious operations. Despite the recommendations of the Lethbridge mission and the obvious interest in bringing this new rifle into service, the wartime economy could be ponderous when retooling and manufacture of what was only an incrementally different weapon was concerned. There was, however, significant effort to produce large numbers, and some 250,000 rifles were produced, with production ending in 1947. And so it was that the No. 5 never saw use in the Far East during the war with Japan, and in fact its first general use wasn't in the Far East at all, but rather in the North. Or North-ish. Norway, in fact. As part of the reconstitution of the 1st Airborne Division after the unfortunate results of Operation Market Garden, the division was issued the No. 5 at the very end of the war as part of the force that would be used to liberate Norway. The intended use of this force was to maintain stability in the wake of the German surrender and withdrawal. As stated, their deployment to that country was on the very eve of the capitulation, and the division spent its time in Norway maintaining public order and managing immediate post-war issues. Despite the inability to get the rifle into the hands of troops already in the Far East before the end, the first troops to be sent from Britain to reoccupy Malaya and Singapore were so armed. The 5th Parachute Brigade was sent as part of the invasion force for the Japanese mainland, but only the advanced party of the brigade arrived in India before the Japanese surrender. They spent the next few months clearing the Japanese and accepting their surrender from Malaya, and then subsequently provided a garrison for the city of Singapore and conducted internal security operations there. Later, they were sent to Java in early 1946, where they stayed until relieved by Dutch forces in May of that year. Despite the No. 5 not seeing meaningful service during the war, it was used extensively in various locations post-war. Two such were in Malaya during the emergency, which was from 1948 to 1960, and in Kenya during the Mau Mau uprising from 1952 through 1960. Both were significant counter-insurgency operations that spanned many years. Both operations saw extensive use of the No. 5. In Malaya, the thick jungle was an environment suited to the lighter and shorter No. 5, and was perhaps its most appropriate in-role use. The rifle also saw service in the Middle East, as the British Army undertook a more traditional policing role in the newly post-war world. The No. 5 soldiered on in its now assumed role as the so-called jungle carbine, until supplanted by the newly introduced SLR in the late 1950s. While never adopted wholesale, it did nevertheless fill its intended role of an environmentally appropriate weapon until more modern, self-loading rifles were adopted. There were other developments along similar lines of the No. 5 that deserve mention. In a response to a perceived need for a takedown rifle for airborne forces during the war, a few No. 5s were modified with detachable buttstocks. In Canada, a similar effort was also undertaken to create a shorter, handier rifle, although these never saw service past the trial stages. Along similar lines, Australia made efforts to develop a short rifle of their own, and modified No. 1 rifles, or the SMLE, by shortening the forend. They also produced a version more akin to the No. 5, with the wood cut back from the muzzle. As mentioned, these were all generally experimental, and never saw meaningful service. Now, examination of the No. 5 can't all be talk. Perhaps a shooting comparison would be interesting. I devised a series of 5 practices, all based on historical examples, and with historical targetry to effect the comparison. For more information about Army qualifications with the rifle in the late war period, I've done a video on that very subject, the 1942 Wartime Rifle Course, as well as late war close-quarter shooting techniques. The practices I chose were initially to include grouping, application, snap, and rapid shoots, at ranges from 25 to 300 yards. Ammunition used for these practices for both rifles was commercial SMB, which uses a 180 grain full metal jacket projectile. Practice number 1 was to compare grouping capabilities at 100 yards, 5 rounds with each rifle. Right off the bat, the similarities were obvious. The sights set the same way, and both rifles loaded with customary ease. I decided to use the small aperture with the slide all the way down. This was somewhat ahistoric, but I wanted to see where the rifles were grouping with this particular ammunition. As you can notice here, and it was grossly evident when shooting, the recoil of both rifles was remarkably similar. There was a slight increase to felt recoil with the number 5, but nothing to write home about. As it was, both rifles grouped within the historical highest possible score of 4 inches, giving 25 points for both. As you'll note, the number 5 grouped exceptionally low. With a view to a level playing field as I progressed into application shooting, I shot another group, not filmed, with the sight set at 200, and this brought the MPI up to a reasonable location. Field expedient fixes for ammunition, or perhaps some other sighting issue. Practice number 2 was a 5-round grouping at 300 yards. This originally had been scheduled as an application practice. In other words, scored by the number of hits rather than the group size. But because I hadn't had any practice with the number 5, and in light of the somewhat puzzling sighting issues, I changed this to a grouping practice, and trebled the allowable group sizes for the 100-yard range. This was shot from the fire trench position using my stand-up shooting bench as seen in other videos. Again, I direct you to the visibly similar recoil exhibited by the number 5. As it was, the number 5 shot a completely respectable 8-inch group at 300 yards, which was well within the 12-inch group for top score and 25 points. The number 4 was a bit looser at 18 inches, which was still good enough under the 24 inches allowable for 20 points. Practice number 3 was a close quarters snap at between 15 and 75 yards, with 3 rounds shot, with 3 exposures of 3 rounds each, shot using the close quarter shooting technique as was taught in the late war period. This has already been explored in a previous video on the channel. The idea was to use the close quarters method, including the use of the middle fingering technique, followed by a somewhat more deliberate engagement at the farther target. Despite the short range, the small target, the number 5 figure, was a challenge to hit without the sights, although I did hit it 3 times. I also made 3 hits on the number 4A, but only just. I nicked the very bottom of the target with the 3rd round. And please, don't ask how I missed that second engagement at the figure 2. While I had used the number 4 in this type of practice before, it was something I was looking forward to use the number 5 and see if the lighter weight and handling would be a benefit. It was certainly easier to hold in this proto-alert position, although it did take some effort to realize where to hold under the chin for effective target engagement. As it was, as much as the number 5 was handier, my unfamiliarity with its use in the close quarter role proved to be somewhat of a detriment. Only 2 hits on each of the number 5 and the 4A, with the number 2 getting 3 hits, although they were quite low. At 3 points per hit, the number 4 scored 24 and the number 5 scored 21. Practice number 4 was a more conventional 5-round snap at 200 yards. As in previous videos, I've had to rely on a timer to delineate the 5-second exposure. I have, however, included a digital model to illustrate how the target was presented. The use of the position of readiness was a historical application, but by late war its use had declined during official qualification practices. Having a nice quality steel target was a definite bonus. As you can see, the intent of the position of readiness was for the soldier to remain hidden until the target appeared. I chose this method to further assess the handiness of the number 5. I must admit, with the rifle lying on the parapet, the extra length of the number 4 isn't particularly encumbering. Interestingly, the number 5 had its sight set to 300 yards, despite the 200-yard range. As you have seen, this resulted in reasonable hits. Finishing the 5th round, there really wasn't a difference between the two rifles, especially if hits within the time frame are used as the primary judgment. Both rifles scored a perfect 5 hits, giving 15 points to each. Practice number 5 was a 10-round rapid at 200 yards at a small or 4-foot classification target. As with any historical rapid practice, the rifle began loaded with 5 rounds. Subsequent rounds were loaded from the pouch or bandolier. Things went along well enough until my brain farted and I lost count of my rounds while in the middle of the practice with the number 4. Also during the shooting with the number 4, I noticed a strange preponderance of the rounds to be somewhat sticky in the chamber. I can't really explain it, as the rifle didn't suffer from such an ailment at any other time during the day. Fortunately, my inattention didn't stop me from making the 40-second mark. Just. Whew. For rapid shooting, all hits inside the inner were 3 points. This gave the number 4 a perfect score of 30, while the chronically low shooting number 5 only 27. This left me with total scores for both rifles that were only 1 point apart. 114 for the number 4 and 113 for the number 5. So what did it all mean? Overall, the number 5 is a joy to shoot. The so-called savage recoil is quite simply non-existent. It is noticeably sharper, but not in any way uncomfortable or savage. I honestly don't know where that reputation has come from. Pointing the rifle is quite effortless, and in that sense it is an advantage. Now, the number 4 isn't difficult to use by any means, but the number 5's lightweight can be felt at every turn. As for performance, the numbers speak for themselves. Any real faults were mine, through bad drills or unfamiliarity with the sighting, lending to some low shooting, as discussed. Finally, I'll speak to the so-called Wandering Zero that purportedly was a somewhat unexplainable feature of this rifle. For those unaware, this referred to the rifle losing its ability to shoot to the same mean point of impact between engagements or outings. This is outlined quite extensively in Skennerton's book, I Lee Enfield, but in recent times it has proven to be a bit of an enigma. Many modern shooters do not experience such anomalies and are quite satisfied with the rifle's performance. As for that specific detriment being a reason for the number 5 not being adopted as the general service rifle, I think that wartime economies, and perhaps its somewhat overall lesser performance and accuracy at longer ranges, although my results don't necessarily show that, were probably the reason why. In the end, it wasn't that the number 5 was horribly deficient, but rather that a new generation of military firearm, the SLR, was coming into service, giving a much-needed generational leap forward, and this was more of a cause of its demise than anything else. Had the number 5 entered service earlier in the war, it certainly would have seen use in the Far East, and the so-called Forgotten Sons of the 14th Army would certainly have benefited from its lightweight, short length, and overall handiness, as they fought the Japanese to a standstill at Kohima and Imphal, then pursuing him across the ruthlessly difficult terrain of Burma, rivers, jungles and plains to Rangoon by war's end. I'd like to thank friend of the channel James for the lending of his number 5 for purposes of the photography that I used in this video. He also made the kind proviso of the bayonet. And also to friend of the channel Vince, whose rifle we used for the shooting aspects of this video. In addition, his son Hayden came out and helped to pull the targets for the snap shooting. Without your help, it wouldn't have been nearly as exciting.
Nice.
Thanks as well needs to be given to steeltargets.ca. They're a company from Alberta, Canada, who worked with the channel extensively to design and fabricate the custom steel targets used in this video. So if you're in the market for historical 20th century military targets, the designs are on file. Drop them a line. If you'd like to support the channel, please stop by our Patreon page. The link is in the description below. And for more information on projects and updates between videos, follow us on our Facebook page.